Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Follycast, the Rivers of London podcast. I'm Margaret in Sutton and joining me are...
Richard in Fulham.
Jan in Worcester.
Denny in Bath.
After detouring over the last few podcasts into the novellas and short stories, we are back in the main series. And today's discussion will reach the latest novel to be released, which is False Value. Apart from Richard, we're all new to this one. So let's dive in with a quick synopsis for those who have not read it recently. We will be going into some plot points and spoilers. So what happens in False Value?
Well, it's January 2016 and Peter is undercover at the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation, whose work is of interest both to the Folly and the National Crime Agency. And there seems to be a connection between the origins of computers, that's the work of Lovelace and Babbage, punch cards and the Mary engine, magic, and the AI work taking place in the secret lab at the company. Meanwhile, New York magic practitioners from the Librarians group are in town, Stephen and Patricia Chin. Peter and Beverly are living together and her pregnancy is progressing. The couple befriend Peter's new boss and his family, and she holds court in Richmond Park.
The plot pivots around a number of action sequences, a dramatic chase scene in the London Library, Peter foiling an attempt on the Australian tech tycoon, a spider drone attack in a flat in Tottenham, a knife attack in Maidstone, a heist that goes wrong at the tech company, and there's a final showdown in an industrial estate in Gillingham in Kent. We are left with a feeling that a major evil is out there, and there are a number of unresolved plot lines. An Australian tech giant is still at large, and Beverly is just a few weeks away from giving birth.
And if you've never read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, good luck to you because the references are everywhere.
So let's dive in with overall impressions before we talk more in detail about various aspects of the book. So Jenny and Jan, what did you make of False Value?
I found it really hard to read. I kind of came to the conclusion that if you dropped parts 1 and 2 and started at part 3 and then finished just before the end, then that was probably the optimum reading. And I think it's down to several really irritating plot devices that he introduces quite early on, like going backwards and forwards with characters who end up having the same name, having way too many characters that don't do anything and actually naming them. So you have no idea whether they're meant to be significant when you first encounter them, and then you find you don't encounter them again at all. And actually naming all of the total executive cover, who is Skinner's bodyguard, is completely unnecessary. This example comes up time and time again. I think, okay, I'm going to make a note of this person because he's got an interesting name, and then they never appear again, which just adds to the confusion. So I did find it really hard to read. I had to read the whole of the first couple of chapters again, and I think there were ways in making this much easier to read. I thought that there's some great writing in it, as always. The ending was very, very quick, kind of Doctor Who style ending, which was pretty unsatisfactory, I think, although it did tie up loose knots. Ettersberg was covered right at the end in a footnote, and I think it deserved more than that. But on the other hand, when it got to the end, I was really quite pleased that everybody had made it through. But I do think that the confusion at the beginning made it really hard to take seriously the real danger that was coming in the back half of the book. So that's my potted version.
I agree about the confusion at the beginning. I went back about an hour ago, actually, to just look at the beginning to see if I could work out why that device had been used, the jumping around. And I still can't see really why it was necessary to do it that way. I'm sure that Ben Aronovich is completely clear about why he's done it, but it was a little bit confusing. And it felt as the story went on that it wasn't necessary to be that confusing at the beginning. I also agree about the inclusion of some characters that you didn't come across again. And some had some of the names, then you were trying to jot them down and then they didn't reappear. Having said that, I did like the fact that this seems to be a really sort of more grown-up Peter. And I think we see a lot more into the sort of his domestic setting with Bev. Also, I like the fact that Bev, we saw the way she reacted to the Johnsons and their family setup. I thought that was interesting. I quite like it when Reynolds pops up from the US, and I could see the reason for that, you know, because of the characters that were really going to end up being her responsibility. So I thought there was lots that I did like about it, but I completely see what you're saying, Jenny, about some of the characters and the confusion at the beginning. But I did love the bit about Babbage and Ada Lovelace, and some of that was quite complicated. I was trying to work out what these different engines were and their relevance and some of the ideas. But again, I did like the way it finished up. I found that quite satisfying. And this was definitely a contrast to the frantic nature of Lie Sleeping, which came before.
Well, that's interesting, because having been the person in the role of being the Debbie Downer on the Abigail book, I'm going to go the opposite direction this time. I really particularly like the first half, and I loved the deliberate juxtaposition of the first few chapters, because that was, you know, I fell for it, as in I assumed that he really had, you know, had to leave police work and get a job, you know, in Civvy Street, because that's kind of what was being set up at the end of Lie Sleeping, that, yeah, he was on indefinite leave. So having you fall for that and think he really is having to get a job in security, and then the subsequent chapter that goes back in time that sets the scene, you start to realise what's going on. I'd be interested to know whether that was something that was done later on once it was written to kind of pep up the start, but I really enjoyed that. I can see how it could have been confusing, but the non-linear timey-wimey nature of it didn't trouble me. The other thing is, thematically, this book is probably the closest to things that I am interested in more generally. Things like artificial intelligence, the Turing test, the singularity, or the nerd singularity as he refers to it, tech companies, Google, Facebook, you know, all that stuff. So I thought it was really interesting. Also, this is the first book where he's been undercover, him actually going in not as a policeman, but just being, you know, an employee, a Vogon guard of this company. So I found that all quite refreshing and new and quite important. To me, my interest slightly tailed off towards the end. I agree with Jenny. The ending is a bit, we've got 10 minutes to go and we need to wrap it up. All those drones in the lorry never did get to wreak havoc in Gillingham or wherever they were. They got destroyed before they could do anything. But we talked many times over the first few podcasts about it being a hybrid of fantasy and detective, and walking that line between being a police procedural and a Harry Potter style fantasy. To me, this book, and I don't know if it's going to be a trend, is a three-way hybrid with the SF cyberpunk genre as well, going more into sort of William Gibson and Neil Stephenson territory. And we can debate whether that three-way hybrid works or whether magic sits comfortably alongside, you know, cyberspace and servers and computers and so on. But I really liked it.
I'm sort of in the middle. I did like the fact that I fell for the first chapter of him having to be in Civvy Street, and I think that was a good way to start because it's quite a contrast to what he was doing before, although I have got reservations about that I'll pick up later about his character. What I also liked was I liked the bit in the library. I liked some of the aspects of it and some of the action in it. I like the fact that some of my favourite characters were like not only Bev, but there were some interesting bits for Gleed. Nightingale did a lot more, but I still feel like, Jenny, I haven't got enough information yet about Ettisburg. I felt a bit sort of like, filing cabinets, and then it was over in 2 pages and I wanted to know more. Like you, I felt much more comfortable once I was in the sort of section 3 and section 4 and it was moving. And again, like you, I went back and read the first section again just because it helped me. And then, you know, there's a bit where he meets Stephen, who's actually called Jacob at that point, and then you go back to him being in the library as the conceit of way to start the novel. It's quite clever, but again, I think you take no prisoners there, and if you're not really invested in Rivers of London, then you're going to get really sunk in it. Apart from a brief spell of pretending to be undercover with Leslie in a flat, and this is his proper first time undercover, do you think this was a good plot device, and did it work for you?
Yes, definitely. You couldn't do anything like this unless you were undercover, and particularly with this type of organisation. I think it was a very good choice. Mm-hmm. A plot to look at the potential for harm for big tech companies.
I just like that scenario. There's a series of semi-humorous detective novels called the Charles Paris detective novels by Simon Brett. There's 25 of them. And in each of those, he's an out-of-work actor, and each time he gets a new job, it might be at a TV company or a touring rep company or on a game show or whatever. And the fun of it is him embedded, obviously he's not undercover, he is himself, but he's having to understand the dynamics of a different group of people, what their relationships are with each other, how that situation works, how that particular industry, whether it's television or a radio soap opera or whatever works. We actually mentioned that as a series of books when we were at a talk that Ben Aranovich did with Andrew Cartmel, and they straight away said, oh yes, we love Charles Paris. I'm sure they are an influence. I think that's why I like this book. If it had been yet another, them turning up at a murder, them working out what had happened, I may be wrong, but I don't think anyone dies in this book for the first 250, 300 pages. Isn't Leo Hoyt the only person or the person to die? So
indirectly, there's the murders in America previously that Reynolds finds.
Yeah, they're cold cases in a way, though. Yeah. We don't even see Leo Hoyt being murdered, do we? We only hit. No. Do we see any violence that results in anyone dying in the whole book? Is that a first?
We see quite a lot of violence, but it doesn't result in anyone dying. No, you're right.
If you compare it to Lie Sleeping, where the bodies are piling up around the M25 in various mysterious circumstances, it is a different structure. I think it's the most different structure with possible exception of Foxglove Summer, it's the most different structure of books so far.
I thought the creation of the company as well, the SCC, I found that very plausible. This ridiculous tradition of having to wear this towel all day, and the fact that, the names, the mice and the Vogons, and then all the machines there that are delivering what you'd think, if you go into one of these companies and you see that all this food that you can get there and all this, and all this is available. And then you're thinking, but at what cost? It's so that you don't leave the building. Basically, you'll stay there. And
the one difference was the insistence that you left at 5 o'clock, which
only for the Vogons, though, wasn't it? It said they were different. The mice,
the mice were expected to work at weekends, weren't they?
Yes, Peter goes because he's expected to, doesn't he? We thinks he should do on a Sunday, and that's how he can get in and chat to people in a slightly more controlled way. But even the whole sort of like what you could take out of the building and the lockers and the phones that they have, and
the fact that you had to pick up this phone that you could only use internally and you couldn't use your own phone. It was very.
What I thought was weak was understanding what they were doing with the Mary engine and the rose jars and the 3D printing. When that explanation was delivered, it was really close to the end of the book. I think it should have come a lot earlier.
Yeah, I agree.
Working alongside all of the powers of the law and security agencies. Yeah. I got the 3D printing of drones quite quickly, and that they were somehow charged with some kind of bit of software, but I had no idea what that was for, and what the plan was. I'm not sure we had it completely by the end anyway, but I have some understanding of why this was so important to Skinner.
On the one hand, you could argue that he doesn't patronise the reader. He doesn't spell it out. But equally, I think there is a trend, I may be wrong, but I mean, certainly in modern television, to under-explain things. to assume that you are hanging on every word and slotting everything together. And that's sometimes why it's quite refreshing if you dig out an old episode of The Avengers or sort of Mission Impossible, or, or 60s or even 70s shows where they're not giving you a Rubik's Cube. Conversely, they continually explaining the plot to you. But I wonder if I may have a more positive view. I didn't enjoy it quite so much the first time. I enjoyed it the first time, but I enjoyed it a lot more the second time, because to Jenny's point, I knew how it would end, so I knew what was going on with the Mary engine and the rose jars, and therefore it made more sense to me in retrospect.
But you don't have to insult the reader. The reader could be in the know, but the people who are working this not in the know. It depends.
Do you not think it's a balance, though, isn't it? I think we're working on where the balance is, because obviously there's a lot of tech stuff in there. There's a lot of AI stuff in there. And if it's not something you're interested in, you may not want to know all that level of detail. But at the same point, to your point, Jenny, we haven't got enough. So it's just the balance is not quite right, because you don't need it in so much detail that you need pages of it. Yeah. But perhaps you needed an extra page just to explain how it all connected together. So it's that sort of balance between, I know enough, it's fine, the plot's moved on, I know what the resolution is, as opposed to...
As Nightingale saying, I think what they might be trying to do is this.
Yes.
So then the reader's in the know, but everybody else is still in the dark.
Would you not think for Peter to explain all the computers and how that all works to Nightingale in a page would have been quite a triumph in itself?
It would.
I'm not completely clear of Skinner's intention. I mean, you're sort of led to believe that he's quite malevolent, and yet he doesn't. We don't really understand what his intention is to do with the Mary engine. I mean, he says, doesn't he, he's not interested in money, even though he's a billionaire. It's just the fact that you can do this. That's why we want to do it. But you're not really certain, what is he going to do with it?
I don't think he knows. I think he thinks that if he builds something like this, then it will make him more powerful, but he doesn't know what it is or what he can do.
Clearly he wasn't aware of what was, the influence the bell jars were having, or effectively what he created was off doing what it was doing.
There's a piece missing as well, isn't there? Because it's not just him. There's somebody who must have worked out the Mary engine reverse and did it all. There's that American connection. Yeah. There's something that's still to be explored.
There are a few things deliberately, I think, left unexplained. But part of, to take Jenny's point about explaining things, that I think we're all in the same place, and that we like the fact this is written in the first person, and we like the fact it's Peter relating it. But where it can fall down at times is things can't be explained until Peter has experienced them. So if this were, to Jenny's point, an episode of Doctor Who, pretty early on we would have a scene in Gillingham inside that warehouse with Skinner and the Mary engine and the bell jars setting up some creepy thing and them interacting, and you realising where this was heading. But inevitably, when it's first person, things happen in a sequence.
Yeah.
You mentioned mice, which is a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference. Being, I guess, the resident nerd on the podcast, I kept a track, and there are 21 different references to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I mean, some of them are repeated many times, like, mice and Vogons and the Bambleweenie room and so on, but separate allusions, there are 21 of them. Were you that aware of them? Have you read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? I mean, either was it annoying, enjoyable if you had read it, or did it just go completely over your head?
I was probably top level aware. So I wasn't aware of mice, Vogons being Hitchhiker's Guide. I was aware of certain words being Hitchhiker's Guide, and that didn't bother me at all.
I mean, towels. Always have your towel with you.
Always have your towel with you. That's the one essential thing you need, according to Ford Prefect. Diana, have you read Hitchhikers?
No, but I did listen to when it was serialized. I've not read the books, but I did listen to it.
I didn't mind it. At times I found it a bit grating, but I lived with it, and I thought some things were quite clever, like the towel on the head, and because it does lead into that whole sort of deep thought thing at the end and the answers to the universe and stuff like that.
Where does that come from?
Deep thought is connected with the computer, I think, isn't it?
Wow.
Deep thought was the computer that was built in order to give the answer to the secret of the life, the universe, and everything.
Yeah.
And after millennia of computation, they go up to the computer and finally say, okay, what is the answer to the life, the universe, and everything? At which point the computer says 42. And they say, well, what does that mean? They say, well, you never said what the question was. I've personally found it really clever the way it was used for two reasons. Firstly, because Jenny and I, in our careers, have been in to see people like Google as clients, and I've been into Twitter's office. In Twitter's office, for example, the first thing you saw was a rusty Dalek in the foyer. The Google offices of Victoria used to have, the way you got between two of the floors was via a double-decker bus that had been cut in half. So the idea that these tech companies have offices that were a bit like the cross between a children's soft play area and the set of Blue Peter resonated with me a lot. And that obsession with Hitchhiker's Guide, which does go around the tech industry. Without that, I think the character of Skinner would have been a fairly straightforward, one-dimensional archetype that's in virtually every TV drama now. Lenny Henry played a character like him in the last season of Doctor Who.
Yeah.
So that Hitchhiker's thing and his obsession with it brought it slightly to life. That was my impression anyway.
But also, I think he could have also gone down the route of, which perhaps for us, but may have been better for other people, that sort of obsession with gaming that you get in the IT community. Like, they're always on online games and they've got a gaming room. And even at the end, Peter's involved in that gaming aspect. But I think, as you say, that gives it a different dimension as well, that he didn't just follow that one typical route of what the assumption of an IT company is. There was that supposedly that added, and it made it funny in parts as well, I suppose.
It allows you to populate your office with people who are obsessives about one or more of these things. I'm quite pleased that they managed to get Line of Duty in with the reference to Chiz.
Yes.
What's that? See, this is a good example of the converse. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Brilliant.
Chiz.
What is it again? It's a human intelligence source.
Yes, it.
Central human intelligence source. It's basically a graphs, isn't it?
Should we talk a little bit about plot? We touched on plot at the beginning. Do you think there were too many layers of complexity?
I don't think it was too complex, but I think the ordering of the information was a little problematic, and there were too many named people. I just counted roughly 39 new characters.
Wow.
And that doesn't include Jacob and Stephen as two. That's them as one.
So it's 39 named new characters.
Yeah, which is just way too many. And many of them weren't used again. And I get what you say about seeding them for future books. But if you can't remember them by the end of this book, then there's not much point in trying to seed them for future books. Unless you start publishing a list of everybody. Which I don't suppose you would want to do, and I just, most of them are unnecessary. So I think that's a big issue, and it left less room for the familiar characters, for the ones we love to read about, and some of them were I think quite changed. Stephanopoulos had some really, really good lines, in relation to Peter. This increasingly grudging regard for Peter that she has, which I think is fantastic. Foxglove came to life here, and actually mixing some of the regular characters with some of the new characters who we may never see again. But the idea of pairing Kira and Abigail in Beverly's Garden, I thought was a lovely scene. But again, I kept having to look up who these people were. Kira and Abigail are outside. Who the hell's Kira?
I did like the picnic scene when they were all together, but like you, I was focusing on key characters rather than name people that were from the company that I thought, well, I don't even know who that is. And as you say, they didn't seem relevant at the time or subsequently, unless they're going to be significant in another book.
We had a bit of a love interest for, I can't even remember whether it was Victor or Ernest. Why did we need a love interest for them? They're ciphers anyway. So I thought he just massively overdid that stuff, and it just created too much kind of crowd noise and didn't let us really see the characters we love or get in detail into the plot. It's just too much background stuff. And I'd like to have seen more of Pete's mum, because she did crop up frequently in connection with the baby and food, but not frequently enough, really, because for that kind of that story arc, the pregnancy and everybody kind of getting involved in that.
Do you think that this might be a limitation of the novel as a form? In the, there's two things that occur to me. One is that if this was on television, you're told a character's name on TV or in a film or in the theatre or whatever, but often you don't remember it because it's not as vital for you to remember it, because they turn up, and if you're watching Game of Thrones, which has got 80 characters or whatever, it's like, oh, it's her, or oh, it's him. Whereas when it's revealed that one of the rose jars is insert name here, you're automatically thinking, I've heard that name before. Why have I heard, who's that? Because you haven't got the visual and the audio clues of who they are. So that there's an element to which, when you've just got these, what number was it, Jenny, of new characters? 39 new names to learn. But also, if you are watching a TV series, you're watching one episode a week. Whereas it will be at least 2 years before we get the next book on From Fool's Value, 2 years from when it was published. So let's say it's out next year, at which point you're asking the audience to remember if some of these characters are brought back. And I'll be surprised if a number of them aren't. Then we need to remember who they are.
I've got a couple of issues. I like Seawold. Would he really have gone down to Maidstone on a Sunday? It was just to get Seawold in, because we hadn't seen him for a while. Because otherwise he had very little to do, and it was nice to have him back, just being, But I also felt, I was talking to Richard about this, I felt it was like Foxglove Summer, but in London, in that Peter, because he's undercover, he has to be in this fully formed, created environment, so you need that detail. But when he was in Foxglove Summer, the only other person with him that we knew was Bev. Yeah. Whereas this is in London, so he's in this computer company. So they have to build it and develop it and make it fully formed and in the plot term. But then you've also got everybody else and the Folly's going through all these changes as well. And there's more characters in the Folly. And that just meant you had that abundance of, as you say, characters, and some of them not getting enough prominence if they are recurring characters, and some of them getting prominence we don't know why.
I think that's why the relationship with the Johnson family worked, because they took them away. So, he went and met them in the Johnson home, and then they got invited to the picnic. So you got some background, they're fostering, and then Bev forming a relationship. So I felt much clearer about those characters.
They all had to be filtered through Peter, and I think that's the limitation of the narrative. And it may be that Ben Aronovich has got to rethink this and still have Peter telling part of the story, but allowing other voices to tell other parts.
Margaret's just mentioned Seawold. I thought the fact that he'd said, "You're a good copper," it seemed to be that sort of acceptance with all those characters that Peter had knocked heads with in previous novels. I think the quality of the relationships now have been really well established. Even though you didn't spend a lot of time with Gilead and some of the other characters, I felt that you could just dip, almost like a soap opera, you know those characters, so they can come in. Whereas you might like to see more of them, I didn't feel that it suffered by not having a lot of time with them.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, and what I think is really nice is that the relationships now extend to Bev. So everybody on the police side always asks about Bev and talks about Bev, and so the two of them are now very much seen as one. Although I think there's worrying things around how he's going to manage when he does finally become a father.
There's some interesting points, isn't there, that we could pick up about his relationship with Bev and Bev's manservant, Maxim, who you probably haven't met before, but is in a graphic novel, and the extent of her power. And that comes in a couple of times, doesn't it? He is slightly worried about what will happen in terms of their relationship, and the fact that she can just glamour people to do what they want, and the solicitor that she manages to get for Oliver. There is a slight unease. I mean, 90% of the time their relationship is perfect, but there's that tension.
I think one of the comments that she made, I think it rings true when she said that we've got so far along our relationship now that the people that we know, our jobs, they're all intermingled, can't separate them out. So I thought that was quite a good explanation, that you could see in the future. You can't just separate them out now. That is going to lead to complications.
Yeah, and it looks like the river gods are going to be more present.
Yeah.
Than they have been up to now.
Personally, I'm really glad that the conversation about Maxim happens, because it was something that was worrying. I don't think I'm satisfied with her answer. This is a character that was introduced in the graphic novel Night Witch back in time, and has popped up I think he's been mentioned in at least 2 other books as being someone who lives almost as a manservant with Beverly. But he is one of, I think, 3 Russian assassins who turn up at Beverly's home. They're looking for Varvara, the Night Witch. And Beverly works her glamour on them, and the other 2 leave, when Maxim just stays and is basically her servant. Does the cooking, does the cleaning, just stays around the house. And to me, that is, and you can tell to Peter, is a pretty disturbing situation. Her argument was, well, how do you know he'd be any better off if he left? But that is, it's good in a way, because you don't want all the characters to be whiter than white. You want to introduce some shade into what's going on, and if you are a river god able to influence things to that degree. But I'm not sure I totally agreed. I'm not sure Peter totally agreed with her response. I mentioned Maxim and his appearance in the graphic novel there. If we put the graphic novels to one side, there are a lot of references to either past books, short stories, things that are seeded early on.
Having tried to get one book to work from page to page, I don't know how Ben Aronovich does it, unless he has some massive Excel file, which has everybody who's ever mentioned in anything, and cross-references them all. He doesn't strike me as that kind of guy. Or he has the same editor doing everything, but I'm not sure that that's the case either.
Which order does it happen? Does he think, I will write a short story about the king rat and the gorilla river god because that will come in handy later on? Or when he's writing this book, does he think, oh, that's handy. Didn't I mention something about them in a short story? I could just use those characters instead. Yeah. He may have started off with something completely different. Thought, oh no, I'll make it the Regent's Canal and have those characters. In some ways, it's lovely the way it's all building this interconnected universe that you can trace all the threads through. Yeah. In others, does it make it near impossible for someone to do anything other than start at the first book? My expectation, wrongly with this one, was that my understanding of Ben Aranovich's TV background and my expectation was that this was season 2, episode 1. And what normally happens with season 2, episode 1 of most series is that they slightly wipe the slate clean in order to welcome on new viewers. You might not have seen last season, but we'll give you a quick recap, and this is what's going on. Now let's set off on some brand new plot arc. And that's kind of what I was expecting. And there may be elements of that with this darkness that's out there in the void that we never quite got to see, that smells of rotting fish or whatever, that presumably is being seeded. But actually, you couldn't just say, oh, just start at Fool's Value and you'll pick it up. I don't know, perhaps I'm wrong. You really wouldn't, would you?
There's no reference really to Martin Shorley, and the references to Leslie are minuscule, if that. I think she's referenced about twice. In a couple of sentences.
But are you expecting him to resolve all of those? Maybe he won't.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
That's it. That was season 1. We're on to new things now.
Yeah. Or maybe that's where he wants you to think we're going. if you see what I mean, because he is quite clever at pivoting things. It might be that that's the way he, we're starting on a new adventure. Folly's changing quite dramatically. Things are moving in a different direction, and perhaps that's the way he wants to go. But there may be things that will come back, or there are still questions we don't know. So,
yeah, and the Folly is having to accommodate more and more people, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's getting a lot of money. It's getting custody sales. Molly's being able to work out exactly how many to cater for breakfast, which is a good thing.
Yeah, but the catering seems to have been improved massively. Nothing odd as in the first few books. That's why I think we need a Molly Cookbook. We need to know how to make cheese puffs, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah, in the early books, they'd be quite alarmed at what might be in a packed lunch provided by
like
Molly.
offal sandwiches.
Yeah.
I got a sense in this book that, and not a very pleasant sense, that we could be saying goodbye to Nightingale. So
what, in terms of his retirement?
Yeah, his retirement, but also kind of maybe he thinks he's wrapped up Ettisburg. We don't need to know more about that.
It would be a massive loss, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I'd be really upset.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but Buffy was never the same once Giles went back to England. Because Anthony Head would have made a brilliant Nightingale.
No.
Are you saying that because the Folly is changing and more people are having to be involved?
Partly, but that there's more, I mean, even direct reference to the future of the Folly being in Peter's hands now. Nightingale steps back even further.
Do you think Khalid might have a bigger role in all of that? Because she had a fair bit to do and her character was significantly developed in this than it has been in other novels, really.
With Abigail as the succession plan.
Yes, absolutely.
But you mentioned that it's not just Seawall that's more accepting of Peter and actually gives him a backhanded compliment. It also is that the Met is more accepting of the Folly. I mean, the guy that they go and see when they're investigating the print shops, the local policeman, had actually been on a training course at the Folly. So
all the solicitors as well from the last book got trained as well, and all the custody. They've got 4 custody people as well. So there's been a lot of training going on. They've got
their own interview room at the Folly, and it's much more integrated. I think this is something Jenny picked up in the midway through. That they start off as being this weird enclave that no one talks about, and now they are clearly a fully functioning wing of the police.
I do like the magical wing of the New York Public Library.
Well, the librarians, yes. Okay, so what elements of the book did you enjoy most?
My usual ones. London, particularly in this case because I know that the area around that building, a new river god, just oddities like that. Nightingale, obviously, and just the continuing development of Peter. I
liked the undercover bit. I liked the opportunity to see a different side of Peter, but I really liked the relationships. I've mentioned it already, but it's sticking in my head, the relationship between Bev and Peter and the Johnson family, and the fact that Bev was so concerned about what was going to happen when Tyrell lost his job, and these children that they were there taking care of, these teenagers, how she stepped up to help. So you just felt there was much more insight into her as a character, but it also made it really complicated in terms of the way her life and Peter's were going to continue once they've got, the twins as well. It just looked very happy. They obviously adore one another, but there were lots of hints about the complications ahead. So that was the bit that really stood out to me.
I agree. I liked all of that. And also the point that Beverly's making him more than just a policeman or more than a magic practitioner. He's making him think about the consequences of things. And he's quite concerned the day after they go to dinner, then they're round at Bev's house, and that's just the way that Bev's is. It's almost like he doesn't want that, but that actually adds to the caringness of Bev making him realise that this is the effect that it's going to have on this family and what they actually do. I liked stuff with the lead and what's going on with the lead and with Michael, and these sort of very frank discussions that her and Peter were having while they were sitting outside the container in Gillingham, I found was quite well done. I'm interested to see how the Folly is going to change and all the stuff that was going on with the building and Foxglove and how that might develop. The plot was interesting, but I'm quite interested in some of that tech stuff. But at the same point, for me, it was more in terms of how this played out in the wider Rivers of London universe and developing the characters and moving things forward. And so I like that. Every time we got some, like Reynolds or Sewell or Post Martin very briefly and Abigail very briefly, that all added to the sort of developing the actual story and moving it along through Peter. But yeah, no, it was I enjoyed that.
We talk a lot about plot and character and structure. I don't think we talk that much about the actual writing. And to me, I'd say part I've most enjoyed about it was the writing. I don't know why it stood out particularly this time, but just the way that Ben Aranovich writes, and the way that Peter thinks and his way of looking at the world. It sounds a bit cool, you say pick up a Rivers of London book, it's a bit like Coming Home, but he's got I think an excellent balance of humorous but not to the point where it undermines the plot. The humour complements the plot and makes the plot interesting. It's funny that there's all these Hitchhiker's Guide references, because Douglas Adams, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with his stuff, because it is incredibly clever and funny, but it's influenced a whole generation of writers. A review of something and say, oh, this is a homage or a love letter to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I don't think anyone has really pulled that off since Douglas Adams, despite loads of people trying. And I think Ben Aranovich, I'm glad, doesn't go there. I'm sure he was an influence, and that's why he's in the book. But with Douglas Adams, it just veers over, in my view, into just being silly. Bear in mind, Douglas Adams was a script editor on Doctor Who before he became a novelist and before The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so they have got similar genealogy. But I would take Ben Aranovich's episodes of Doctor Who over the ones that Douglas Adams wrote any time of the day.
He has occasionally, turns of phrase that are so good, you make a note of them.
Yeah.
It's so funny. So here's one that I found. This is when Peter is talking about getting stabbed, police not liking knives. 1 minute you're thinking coffee and bacon sandwich, and the next you're lying in casualty with the word perforated being written down on the clipboard at the end of the bed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a fantastic, light, but explains why there is such concern about knives.
Mm.
I think the writing is as good as ever.
Yeah.
Agree.
It's just too many names.
Anyway, we're all in the same position now. For the first time since we set on this podcast voyage 15 months ago, we've all read all the main books. We're all in the same position. None of us know what's going to happen next. And presumably Ben Aranovich is busy, I think on Twitter, you can tell he's busy writing this. He was up in Manchester this weekend researching for some reason, so we'll find out what that's about. But I guess not too much speculation, but where do you think it goes from here, or where do you want it to go from here?
I presume in the next book that Peter and Bev, their lives will have changed considerably, so it'll be interesting to see how that's going to affect their roles in the book, whether we're not going to really hear about these babies. Or
do you think that'll happen before the book starts, or do you think that their arrival will be described?
In my opinion, they will have arrived by the time we get to the next book.
Off scene. Towards the end, she's getting quite hot, isn't she? Which is an indicator it's coming quite soon, because they talk about the summer at the end, don't they?
Yeah, they say that when she gets super hot, apparently that happens in the final week.
I kind of hope it's already happened by the time the next book.
Yeah.
But also, I'll be interested to see it in terms of his sidekick. I mean, he has Nightingale and he has lead, and normally there's been somebody else with him, and they're sort of Bev, but Bev's sort of there more as moral support and family, I think.
Abigail won't be ready yet, will
no
she?
Yeah.
Or whether there are other things we don't know about. There are some unanswered questions, aren't there? And there might be something with Agent Reynolds, or it might be something to do with who actually engineered the Mary engine that Skinner got in the first. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see where it actually goes, but I'm excited for it. I'm looking forward to it.
Look forward to the next episode.
But I think it could go absolutely anywhere. He could be sent a bit like Foxglove somewhere out of London. I don't think he will do, because I think from what we've gathered, it starts in central London anyway. It starts around Chancery Lane, so I don't think it is. Yeah,
if you follow him on Twitter, you pick up quite a lot of points, but what order they happen in and how they happen is never entirely certain.
So that's what we thought of False Valley, and we'll be back in the autumn.
Meanwhile, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please send us feedback by email at follypodcast@gmail.com, or leave us a comment on our website, thefollycast.com. The Follycast theme you've been hearing is London is Inspired by Cutwater. Links to their site, as ever, in the show notes. And thanks for listening.